Good afternoon and welcome, everyone. I'm Lauren Swartz, President and CEO of the World Affairs Council of Philadelphia. Thank you for joining us today to take a deep and nuanced look at the relationship between Hong Kong and mainland China. Today's program will be structured a little bit differently than our typical program. Today, our speaker, Dr. Zhang, will offer opening remarks, and then we'll move right into your questions. So we've got more time for a dynamic and engaged discussion. Please use the Q&A feature on your Zoom platform to send in questions at any point, and I'll facilitate those questions to Dr. Zhang. As always, the first question will come from a young student passionate about world affairs. So let's get started. In 2019, Hong Kong experienced mass pro-democracy protests. Over the last 2 years, Hong Kong has continued to face increasing suppression of the rights that made it different from mainland China for so many years. From an overhaul of the election system, increased censorship, a crackdown on leaders of the pro-democracy movement, and much more. All eyes are on this part of the world, viewing this situation as a harbinger for China's approach to the region. There is, of course, concern about how and whether democracies, free press, a transparent judiciary, and opposition can survive, and what might the rest of the world do about it? I'd like now to introduce our guest who might be able to help us tangle with some of these complex questions. Professor Steve Tsang is the director of the China Institute at the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London. He is also an emeritus fellow of the St. Antony's College in Oxford and an associate fellow at the Royal Institute of International Affairs. Professor Tsang regularly contributes to public debates on issues related to politics, history, foreign policy, security, and development of the People's Republic of China, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and East Asia more generally. He is known for introducing the concept of consultative Leninism as an analytical framework to understand the structure and nature of politics in contemporary China. He also has a broad area of research interests and has published extensively, including 5 single-authored and 13 collaboratively authored books. One of his latest publications is an article, Party-State Realism, a framework for understanding China's approach to foreign policy, in the Journal of Contemporary China. And his current research project is on the political thought of Xi Jinping. Welcome to you, Dr. Tsang, and thank you for being with us today. I'll pass the virtual microphone to you to make opening remarks, and then we'll turn to our audience for questions. Dr. Tsang?
Well, thank you very much, Lauren. That is most kind of you in your introduction. I understand that you would like me to focus on Hong Kong's democracy movements, the past, the present, and the future. And I will try to do this in between 20 to 25 minutes. Let me start off by going a little bit into the past. I think the past really does affect the present and the future. In terms of Hong Kong's democracy movement, we have to bear in mind that Hong Kong was a British colony until 1997. And much as British colonialism in Hong Kong changed in its nature from the very oppressive approach of the early years to an extraordinarily responsive system of government in the last 2 decades of British rule in Hong Kong, it was nonetheless still colonial, and it left, therefore, certain legacies. Hong Kong under the British was never developed into a democracy. There are many reasons why it didn't do so, but the reality was that it never really was. But by the last 20 years of British rule in Hong Kong, people in Hong Kong enjoy all the rights and freedoms and the protection of the rule of law that citizens of true democracies in Western countries enjoy. But precisely because they didn't actually have a democratic process, the local leaders in Hong Kong did not practice democracy as a matter of fact, as a matter of daily practice or routine. they did not have to fight hard for the rights and freedoms and the rule of law that they enjoy. Therefore, there was a certain element of complacency, naivety, and perhaps the sheer lack of experience for them to be able to work effectively as Democrats in pushing for what they want to push in the present day and moving forward into the future. It also means, even though in the last few decades of British rule, there was a kind of a Hong Kong democracy movement, it never became very strong. And in 1997, the so-called one country, two systems model was implemented in Hong Kong. Now, this one country, two systems model, with Hong Kong enjoying a high degree of autonomy and with a Chinese government promise that the system and way of life in Hong Kong was to be retained for 50 years until 2047, all sound very, very well, except that inherent in the situation was that you had a people in a metropolis used to Western-style democratic ways of life being incorporated into a Leninist political system whose first instinct is about control. And for the controlling system to allow a high degree of autonomy to continue to exist and flourish is inherently challenging. And if the local people could not and did not push not only hard, but very smartly for the local governments to maximize the scope of autonomy and freedom, then that scope of autonomy and freedom will slowly get smaller and smaller. And that, regrettably, is what happened in Hong Kong since 1997. I'm not blaming it all on the people of Hong Kong being inexperienced and not pushing hard enough, because the government in Hong Kong was supposed to do that too, but it didn't. And the Chinese government made that promise that Hong Kong should stay unchanged for 50 years. But implicit in that understanding and undertaking was that at the latest by 2047, when the 50 years was up, Hong Kong would be ready to be fully integrated into China, the PRC, under the leadership of the Communist Party. In other words, the question isn't about the direction of travel, whether Hong Kong could become truly democratic or not. The question was, when will it happen when the Chinese Party state will make Hong Kong much more like the rest of China, so that there will be a smooth transition from Hong Kong as a special administrative region into an integral part of the People's Republic of China. It's a bit of a losing battle for people in Hong Kong to fight, but they have to fight, and they have to fight very, very smart. They never really managed to do that very effectively. They never push for that maximum degree of autonomy, which also means the scope for democracy in Hong Kong was always somewhat limited. Now, we wouldn't know what would have happened if they had pushed hard enough and did all the so-called right things. But what we do know, with the benefit of hindsight, is that the earlier leader in China were more relaxed in terms of their approach towards Hong Kong and about control than the current leader of China, Xi Jinping. We also know, for example, in 2003, when China, under Hu Jintao, wanted Hong Kong to introduce a national security law, something that was required under Hong Kong's basic law, so Hong Kong's constitution, effectively. And more than 500,000 of people in Hong Kong went out on the streets to protest against that national security law. Hu Jintao actually allowed the Hong Kong government to pull back, and the law was not introduced. and Hong Kong returned to get on with their life. So we can see that previously, under Hu Jintao, there was much greater preparedness to be a bit more pragmatic and flexible about Hong Kong. We know under Xi Jinping that's never going to happen. Now, let me move on and talk about something else. That there was a change in paradigm in how Hong Kong was to be dealt with by the Chinese government. And this is a very, very important point that we need to bear in mind and not get too focused on the events of 2019 and subsequently. But I will come back to 2019 and 2020, of course. Now, the change of paradigm is that until 2017, whatever erosion of Hong Kong's degree of autonomy might have happened, the Chinese government or the Communist Party basically stuck to the agreement of 1984 between the United Kingdom and China for the transfer of power in Hong Kong to the so-called one country, two systems model, even though there was always a different interpretation of what that means. But they basically tried. And Hong Kong was being kept and seen as a special administrative region in its own right. What changed in 2017 was that Xi Jinping came up with, to him, a wonderfully powerful concept called the Greater Bay Area. Now, the Greater Bay Area will be centered around Shenzhen, including the big Pearl River Delta region that includes Hong Kong. So Hong Kong will be incorporated into the Greater Bay Area. Hong Kong will still be called a Hong Kong Special Administrative Region, but it will be an integral part of the Greater Bay Area with its center being Shenzhen. I think that is an important change in paradigm in how the Chinese government saw Hong Kong. But there wasn't a decision on the time frame as to how quickly that process of change was going to happen. But the change, the direction for change was already being set. The pace had not been set. And next, of course, we have what happens in 2019. Now, what happened in 2019 was an enormous tragedy of history. It was a totally incompetent government in the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region, completely bungled the introduction of a hated law, which is about extradition of people in Hong Kong to China. For the Chinese government, I think the primary concern would be those people from the mainland of China who use Hong Kong as a haven to avoid the jurisdiction of the Chinese government holding them to account, perhaps for ill-gotten gains or for other misdeeds deemed unacceptable by the government or the Communist Party. The chief executive in Hong Kong, Carrie Lam, decided she couldn't possibly introduce a law like that targeting a specific group. So it must be applied generally. And that got people in Hong Kong really worried and frightened, and they went on the streets to demonstrate in huge numbers, again, sort of 500,000 and more, 1 million and more. When that happened, instead of backing off, as her predecessor did in 2003, Carrie Lam sent in the police and used force against the protesters. And this is again where the history really comes into it. Since the 1980s, in the tail end of the British colonial era, the police and the citizenry in Hong Kong developed a rapport that people in Hong Kong could go out in massive demonstrations and the police would be present, and the police would go there not with riot gears, but in soft hat, armed with bottled waters and medical kits to talk to people and basically say, do you mind moving in this direction? Do you need any help? If anybody needs any help, we will help you. That's the kind of policing people in Hong Kong were used to. So even the use of tear gas and pepper spray by the police in the first instance in 2019 against the members of the public in Hong Kong peacefully protesting, it was seen as an enormous excessive use of force, and that triggered even stronger reactions, and some of which turned violent. But for the Chinese government, this was open rebellion, and this, therefore, must be suppressed. And then we have the enormous changes that would be announced by the end of 2019 and 2020. Again, when they were announced, most people did not really quite see the significance of it. It was not just at the party plenums that a notice was set about how Hong Kong needs to be dealt with more carefully, meaning more robustly, sternly, but also the replacement of two of the three ministerial rank cadres responsible on a daily basis for Hong Kong affairs. The three ministerial rank officials are the chief executive of the Special Administrative Region government, that's Carrie Lam. The second one is the head of the Central Liaison Office in Hong Kong, Beijing's personal representative in Hong Kong, or the director of the Hong Kong Macao Affair Office in Beijing, all full ministerial rank posts. All were Hong Kong hands previously. At the beginning of 2020, the head of the Central Liaison Office was replaced, and then the head of the Hong Kong and Macau Affair Office was also replaced, both being replaced by former party secretaries in China itself. People who had no experience of Hong Kong, didn't know anything about Hong Kong, had no experience dealing with foreign policy matters, and their appointment clearly showed that Xi Jinping expects these two men to be enforcers of his will. And that was a clear message to Hong Kong that Beijing is going to fix it. There was not going to be much more softly trying to understand the sensitivities of people in Hong Kong. And with that, we will have the imposition of the national security law of Hong Kong in the summer of 2020. Now, as I explained before, Hong Kong's constitution, the basic law, has a provision, Article 23, which would require Hong Kong to introduce some form of a national security law anyway. So there is a completely legitimate constitutional basis for Beijing to ask for that to take place in Hong Kong and expedite that process. Nothing wrong with that. The difference is that on this occasion, Beijing didn't require Hong Kong to legislate. Beijing legislated on Hong Kong's behalf with no consultation whatsoever, not even with Hong Kong's chief executive, Carrie Lam. It was simply there, introduced, and effectively created a new security apparatus and regime and parallel court system to try all cases that are related to national security. This is where we are. This is the present. All the activities that people in Hong Kong were able to hold in 2019, the protests, the demand for democracy, the mass demonstrations, the singing of songs about Hong Kong, the showing of slogans, they are now all prohibited under the national security law. If you try to say that people in Hong Kong have a right to self-determination and determine the future, you will have broken the national security law. Oh, by the way, that is not just if one is talking about a Hong Kong person doing it in Hong Kong. It's anybody of whatever nationality, anywhere in the world who advocates the self-determination of Hong Kong or the development of full democracy in Hong Kong, which could exclude the Communist Party, that would be absolutely breaking the national security law of Hong Kong. What we see, therefore, is the Communist Party or the Chinese government seeing democracy as not obeying the party or challenging the national security of China. They are seen basically as the same thing. If you challenge the authority of the Communist Party or Xi Jinping, you are infringing on China's national security. You will be seen as a national security threat. And therefore, local resistance must be crushed. And the stronger the local resistance, the harsher the repression will be implemented. And this is, again, where we are. Now, if this is the reality that we are dealing with, then people in Hong Kong really do not have many choices. They can stand up for their rights and wait to be arrested and be thrown into jail, or they can flee. At the moment, they are still allowed to leave Hong Kong if they want to. Whether that will continue into the future, we don't know. A lot will depend on the changing dynamics between the government and the people. So what is the future? I wish I could be very upbeat about the future of Hong Kong. I was born in Hong Kong. I have a strong affinity to Hong Kong. I love Hong Kong. It's a wonderful place. It's a dynamic place full of amazing people. But I'm also a pragmatic academic analyst. The reality is that the future for Hong Kong's democracy movement is, to put it very mildly, very, very bleak indeed. For the simple reason, as I said before, that the democracy movement is being seen by the Chinese party state as a national security threat. And therefore, they cannot and they will not allow that to continue, let alone flourish. And they will do everything they can to suppress it whenever it raises its head. So if the Communist Party continue to stay in power in China, and there is really very little to suggest the Communist Party will not continue to stay in power in China in the foreseeable future, we are not going to see Hong Kong or Hong Kong's Democrats being able to sustain in any serious sense a democracy movement in Hong Kong. Does it mean that people in Hong Kong will all then accept and embrace the new regime and new way of life? I don't think so. I think we already seen in the last few days how people in Hong Kong react to government suppressions and government's unusual use of descriptions of acts of violence in Hong Kong. It is like, I'm talking about the commemoration by people in Hong Kong of an individual who used a knife to assault a police officer and then committed suicide in public. I mean, that was being described by the Hong Kong government as an act of terrorism, and therefore any act to commemorate the man will be condoning terrorism, possibly leading to somebody becoming a terrorist itself, which is a bit of a pretty ridiculous point to make. But you still have people who are doing that to try to show their defiance. Now, eventually, the Chinese government will grind them down. They have done that with 1.4 billion people. I don't think the people in Hong Kong will be able to completely resist that. But there is already a significant Hong Kong diaspora worldwide, and that diaspora is going to get bigger. And I think a lot of the flame for the cause of democracy in Hong Kong will be kept burning in parts of that Hong Kong diaspora, not in all of that diaspora. Obviously, the diaspora does not speak with one voice. There are huge amount of diversities there, but there will be enough people in the diaspora who will keep that flame growing and burning. I'll stop here and hand it back to you, Laurent. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Singh. A lot to unpack there. You did a wonderful job in 20 minutes of giving us the brief history of the issues we're facing today. And we've got a great amount of audience questions coming in now. It's our custom here at the World Affairs Council to have the first question come from a student, a young person who's passionate about world affairs and might just be a leader helping us solve them in their future. So today we have with us Dana Hungerford. She's a rising junior at St. Joseph's University here in Philadelphia, majoring in international relations, minoring in Spanish and public policy. Dana, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Lauren, and thank you, Dr. Singh, for being here today. My question for you is, if you could please explain your concept of consultative Leninism and describe the role you think it plays in the Hong Kong protests and Hong Kong mainland China relations.
Well, thank you, Dana. The consultative Leninism concept really is to bring us to understand the nature of the government in China. What we are looking at is that there are some defining characteristics of that government. And if we understand and see what those defining character is, then we will be able to map out the way how that government behaves generally and on specific policies as well. So the first thing to underline is that the party state in China is first and foremost about staying in power. It will do whatever it takes to stay in power. The second defining characteristic is that it does constantly reform itself. And that is not only in terms of reform in the economic arena that we have seen, where you can have a Leninist party state, which in some ways looks more capitalist than most capitalist countries in the world. It's also in the political arena. But the changes in the political arena are governance reforms. They are not political reforms that can allow for the development of progressive politics or the move towards democratization. If anything, the governance reforms are there to make sure that it is not necessary for democratizations to happen. This government, this regime is fundamentally anti-democratic. It is not undemocratic, it's anti-democratic. The third defining characteristic is that it advocates a kind of party-centric nationalism, because the consultative Leninism framework was introduced after the Beijing massacre of 1989, which was followed by the collapse of communism in Eastern Europe and then the Soviet Union. The party state in China did realize that communism as a state ideology had effectively bankrupted at that point. It had bankrupted globally, so they were not stupid. And therefore, they moved to have a particular narrative of the Chinese history to generate a particular brand of nationalism that puts the party at the center of it. So if you're a nationalist, you will not only be loving your country, you will love your party. Is my party right or wrong? It also has a very strong element of economic pragmatism. Economic policy is whatever works to keep the party state in power, they are willing to contemplate that and try it and take advantage of it. Now, the problem with Hong Kong and Hong Kong policy is that the importance of Hong Kong to Beijing transformed hugely from the 1980s through the 1990s to now. In the 1980s, when the Chinese government signed the agreements to keep and make the undertakings to allow Hong Kong to stay unchanged for 50 years, Hong Kong's economy accounted for something like a third of the Chinese economy. Hong Kong was the single most important economic locomotive that proved Deng Xiaoping's reform and opening up in the 1980s. Hong Kong was indispensable. Even in 1997, when China took over Hong Kong was something like 20% of the Chinese economy, still utterly indispensable. 2019, less than 3% of the Chinese economy. Hong Kong became dispensable. People in Hong Kong did not understand that dealing with the Chinese government has to be extremely pragmatic. And if they did not play politics right, which is the art of the possible, get what they can, don't stand on the grounds where you can only be crushed, you can never get anywhere. And they did not understand that the Communist Party, in a funny kind of way, does not have a problem with the democratic process. You can have elections. The only thing about the Communist Party is that they want the result of the elections to be known beforehand and pre-approved by them beforehand, which is why they offer Hong Kong direct election of the chief executive in 2014, provided all the candidates have been screened and approved of by the party beforehand. So among a slate of candidates acceptable to the Communist Party, you can freely elect. And people in Hong Kong rejected that because that's not real democracy. Not realizing that if you had accepted that, you could still make that person, that office holder, having to be responsible both to the party in Beijing and to the electorate in Hong Kong. You would still have moved a bit further, but within what is tolerable by the party state. And this is one of the things that I was talking about earlier of the immaturity of Hong Kong's democracy movement fighters. They're fighting too much on the ideal and not enough on the pragmatism. I'll stop here.
Thank you, Dr. Tsang. We have quite a bit of questions coming in for you from the audience. The first two circle around migration. Philip Miller asks us, how do you see the future of migration out of Hong Kong because of the actions of Xi? And Gerald Levin asks a similar question. Are citizens of Hong Kong permitted to leave? What fraction of the population do you think will leave? Will there be a brain drain? Can you talk to us about actions Hong Kongers are taking to leave? Where are they going and what will be left behind?
I think we are going to see a very significant outflow of people and talents from Hong Kong. I think it's a mux game to put a number to it. We are not talking about tens of thousands. I think we are talking at least hundreds of thousands, whether it's very high end of the hundreds of thousands or the low end of hundreds of thousands, I think remains to be seen. And partly that would be dependent on the countries that are willing to receive them. The United Kingdom has a historic obligations to people in Hong Kong and have passed a special legislation about the British national overseas passport holders for them to be settled in the UK. And we are calculating that at least 300,000 people are likely to take advantage of that in the next 5 years. And there are also the usual English-speaking democracies, which are favorite destinations of Hong Kong immigrants. So the US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and they all have made some arrangements to make it easier for people from Hong Kong to emigrate. Now, yes, it will be a significant outflow of talents from Hong Kong, Does it really worry the Chinese government very much? I think probably not that much. It's not that much because there are millions of youngish Chinese on the mainland of China who have received higher educations in Western universities, who would be happy and ready to fill those places that your professionals of Hong Kong who emigrate to elsewhere. It will be in some ways replacing those lot of troublemaking disloyal Chinese by loyal Chinese who are, from the perspective of the Chinese government, just as good at their jobs as those who are leaving. So I don't think that they would be particularly worried about it. And if they were to introduce restrictions on outward movement of people from Hong Kong, I think it's not because they are worried about the outflow of talent. It's because they found the disloyalty of those people who choose to leave unacceptable and therefore need to punish them.
It's interesting, all the overtones of what you're saying about that China no longer needs Hong Kong in the way that Hong Kong felt that it once does, and as an economic hub, as a trade hub, as a tip of the spear of being open to the world. And the percentage of GDP impact and changes the talent game has changed tremendously. And I think that's something a lot of the world is still catching up to. The brand of Hong Kong of being open is so strong and the center of business, but China has changed around that, and which this idea causes us to take a look up north towards Taiwan. And we have two questions that are targeted around Taiwan. So I'll ask them both as they're intertwined. Paul Liebman asks us, how do you expect current events in Hong Kong to play out in the future fate of Taiwan? And what will the free world do about it? Kent Jurin on our audience today also asks us, what are the similarities and differences between China's Hong Kong and Taiwan policies? Dr. Tseng, can you talk to us about what's happening in Hong Kong might play out in Taiwan? What's similar and what's different?
I think the Hong Kong story and the Taiwan story will be very, very different. The main difference really is a matter of geography. Hong Kong is attached to the mainland of China with a land border. Hong Kong is a very small place. Hong Kong, and this was something which was actually explored before the British decided to hang Hong Kong back to China. Hong Kong was militarily indefensible. Taiwan is separated by treacherous water of some 90 miles, with a significant defense force, which is backed by a global superpower, of which it has a legal obligation under its own domestic law, that I'm talking about the United States and the Taiwan Relations Act, to help the people of Taiwan to defend themselves if the future of Taiwan were to be changed. I think that fundamentally changed everything in the comparison between Hong Kong and Taiwan. Hong Kong really didn't have a choice in terms of the reintegration with China. And Hong Kong was clearly a part of China. I don't think that was something that people have ever contested about. Taiwan is a very different kind of story. Historians argue whether Taiwan really is properly part of China. It is something that is open to different interpretations. And there is not one interpretation that is absolutely, totally, overwhelmingly convincing one way or the other. The Chinese government does try to see Hong Kong as a model for the integration of Taiwan. And it is remarkable that they still haven't really totally acknowledged that what they have done in Hong Kong in the last 2 years will almost ensure that people in Taiwan will want to defend themselves until the last person. if Hong Kong were a roaring success in the eyes of people in Taiwan, that the integration did not in any way diminish the kind of democratic rights and freedoms and the dignity of the individual in Hong Kong, then it would be a lot easier for people in Taiwan to contemplate the idea of a union with the mainland of China. I think for people in Taiwan, they simply will see the situation as if this is the future of, if the future of Hong Kong, Taiwan is to be like the present of Hong Kong. Thank you very much. You can keep it. We don't want it. What will the international community do? We are talking about, first and foremost, what the United States of America will do. And it is not change simply because of Hong Kong. Hong Kong is one factor, but there is a basic change, a structural change in the relationship between China and the United States. For 40 years, the United States was remarkably relaxed and comfortable in helping China to modernize and develop. Not any longer. With the way Hong Kong went, Taiwan becomes much more important of an issue. It simply got pushed up the political agenda. And we will then therefore have to look at the overall strategic importance of Taiwan to the United States now and moving forward. The entire US Indo-Pacific strategy since the end of the Second World War was built on the partnership with Japan. So Japan comes in very importantly. Southeast Asia also comes into the figure. Washington will have to make a simple calculation. If Taiwan were to be taken by China, whether it's by force or simply the threat to use force, but not a unification by voluntary action on the part of Taipei. Either way, it will mean either the United States has been deterred by Beijing, or the United States forces will have been defeated by the Chinese military. Because the United States is, under the Taiwan Relations Act, requires to consider all options to help Taiwan defend itself. There is a legal obligation to the US administration. And if that should happen, either way, Japan will no longer rely on the United States protection under the Japan-US Defense Act. The whole of Southeast Asia will not believe that Uncle Sam can be counted on for anything. The entire equation in the Indo-Pacific region will change. Korea will have to do their own deals with Beijing. Entire ASEAN countries of 10 will do their separate deals with Beijing. Japan will have to make its choice. It either goes nuclear and do whatever it can to defend itself, hoping that Americans can still be counted on when the day comes, or it will have to do a deal with Beijing. I can't see any US administration, whatever party, willing to consider such a scenario. And that being the case, I will find it very, very difficult to believe that if and when the Chinese government try to change the status of Taiwan, the United States will have its hand folded and do nothing. Back to you.
What a chessboard you have just laid out for us, Dr. Tseng. A lot to think about, especially for any administration. And right now, so many countries are consumed with domestic issues at home and poking their heads up to look at foreign affairs and seeing what they can do, and then diving back into the pandemic and many other challenges at home. I know eyes are watching Biden and his foreign affairs team to see how they'll approach this, and the choices you laid out are difficult at every turn. So we'll be watching certainly with you. We have a question from Mitchell. What % of the population supports and is in favor of the Beijing government? What percentage of the Hong Kong population is supportive of Beijing? Do we have a number there?
I can't tell you. I don't know what percentage it is. I don't believe that anybody has done a survey that will put it in those terms. I think we have to sort of look at it in a much more nuanced way, as to look at it in a binary way. I don't think people in Hong Kong is either we support Beijing or we oppose Beijing. I think there are many different shades of grey in between. You have people in Hong Kong, not small number of them, who actually very much strongly support the Chinese government. Bear in mind that Hong Kong is an immigrant community that since 1997, off the top of my head, I would say probably 1 million or so people from the mainland of China would have one way or the other settled in Hong Kong. Now, some of them would be very supportive of the Chinese government, whatever the Chinese government does. Not all of them. I mean, they are not one simple monolithic group of people. I mean, some of them are completely devoted to democracy. Jimmy Lai is one of them. Believe it or not, Jimmy Lai was a mainlander who made Hong Kong home and become one of Hong Kong's most well-known freedom fighters. And he is languishing in jail. Target number one of the Chinese government. You also have people who were born in Hong Kong, grew up in Hong Kong, who never really like all this British Western stuff. And they are comfortable with being proud Chinese, which is what the Chinese government tells them, this is what you will be, and this is what we ask you to be. We don't ask you to be anti-Hong Kong, we ask you to love Hong Kong, just love it in a different way from those young people who are doing it the wrong way. And then you have people who are, well, I don't do politics, just keep it out of my sight. I don't want to do anything with it. I don't care. Whichever, Chinese, British, Hong Kong government, all just as bad, or just as good. I love them all, so I don't mind either way. To all the ways through your people who are mildly supportive of democracy, to some of them say, I'll do whatever it takes. If it means I die, I'll go for it. I won't accept Chinese rule whatsoever. We just saw it in the last week. One individual who did that. They exist. How many? I think not that many. But let's also not forget that governments that use very strong oppressive measures and expensive and not very credible rhetoric often produce counter effects. It's we call it radicalization. Freedom fighter and terrorist sometimes comes together. In fact, a lot of the time in the modern era, one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. And the government in Hong Kong has demonstrated in the last week total ignorance in how to manage the situation. When they branded the individual who assaulted a police officer and committed suicide a terrorist, they potentially turned that person into a martyr figure for some of the people who want to see it that way. And by them now saying that even thinking of this man as potential martyr, as a worthy individual to be commemorated, whose life should be remembered, is not accepted, then you are probably going to actually radicalize even more people. The harder they go, the more that effect will be. But I think we're still talking about very, very, very small number of people in that side. But I can't tell you exactly what percentage it is.
Sure. Yes, I can't imagine there's a survey going around where people would freely answer which government they support. We have a question from Julie that touches on this idea of the complexity of allegiance. but this time from the Beijing side. Julie asks, how likely do you think it would be for a reformer to rise up within the Chinese Communist Party without first disclosing their progressive leanings, and then become a leader in the party who eventually could enact reforms towards democracy in China?
Not in the lifetime of Xi Jinping. As long as that man breathes, it's not going to happen. I mean, there is a few assumptions here. One is that Xi Jinping will stay in power as long as he is alive, which I think is the most likely scenario. The terms of office has become irrelevant. He's changed that completely. Under that consultative Leninism framework that I described, they actually institutionalize a succession that a leader will only serve for 10 years and then will hand over to the next generation of leader who would have had 5 years as an apprentice leader before taking over power. Very clearly structured and arranged. All these are gone.
Yeah.
And not only has that succession arrangement has been removed and successor not being named in the last party congress in 2017, which is when one should have been named, or two should have been named. Xi Jinping also changed something very, very important, but not usually in the headline. In the post-Mao era of China, if you were a retired member of the very top echelon of power, the Politburo Standing Committee, usually a committee of 7 or 9, you enjoy immunity in retirement. You and your families are untouchable. Xi Jinping broke that rule when he went for Zhou Yongkang, brought him down, thrown him in jail. Now, nobody shed a tear about Zhou Yongkang being thrown into jail. He was not a very nice man, put it this way, to the extent that really no one would shed a tear for him, maybe apart from his family and very close associates. But by doing that, if Xi Jinping were to stand down and hand over to a successor, Xi Jinping can no longer be able to be sure that he will be able to protect his family or himself in retirement, because that immunity has been ended. And that makes it almost impossible for Xi Jinping to hand over power to somebody else until nature takes its course.
Does that ultimately weaken the party when Xi Jinping eventually perhaps becomes ill or just becomes quite old? This lack of the process being known with the successors being lined up has been a sign of strength and stability, which people could invest in and believe in culturally. But now that is gone. So this immense stability or consistency we see with President Xi Jinping is a gift now, but does it turn into a liability later? How might they handle that?
I think you are absolutely right. And that's why there are significant voices or significant opinions within the upper echelon of the Communist Party who are not comfortable with the direction of travel. The institutionalization that was in place before Xi Jinping greatly strengthened the capacity of the Communist Party to stay in power for a long period of time because of that elimination of instability in a succession situation. One of the biggest advantage a democracy has over a autocratic system is the succession. Democracies, by and large, don't have succession problems. You have a institutionalized process of how that is going to happen. The United States have run through a very, very, very difficult time recently, but you came out you came through it, it's not a problem, you can deal with it. The Chinese system is being put back into the old-fashioned dynastic kind of succession arrangement, and it is always problematic. And it's not a particularly Chinese thing. European countries, when they were monarchies, also had problems with succession. And that's with clearly defined succession rules. And now you have no clear succession rules in China. So when that time comes, it will be very messy. I mean, if Xi Jinping should have a long period of ill health, then China would be going through a longish period of difficulties. If it happens all very quickly, it might actually be a lot easier to manage.
Indeed. Well, all eyes are in China for many reasons, and Hong Kong and Taiwan. Certainly a succession plan is not the only one. Dr. Tseng, that's all we have time for today, despite the many questions waiting in the queue for you. Thank you so much for joining us and for giving us this intimate and deep and honest insight into what we see going on into this most dynamic region of the world. We're grateful for your time and your expertise and your wisdom. And thank you to our audience today for joining us, and the members of the World Affairs Council and new friends for joining today. We encourage you to register for the Council's other upcoming programs as well, which are all listed on our website. We'll be exploring topics like Chile's leadership on food innovation and technology for our global community. Of course, taking a look at the conflict between Israel and Palestine, and a perspective on Putin's rule for the last 21 years in Russia, a rule that is drawing more and more comparisons with what we see going on in China. And we will also return to in-person programming this fall. I can't yet share who will be our speakers at the podium, but I can assure you we do have a very exciting lineup of real-time, real face-to-face programming, but we will continue to have online access and streaming programs and capabilities as well. So please stay tuned for those announcements, which you again can find on our website at wacphila.org. Dr. Tseng, thank you again, and I wish everyone a good day.
Well, thank you very much, Lawrence. Great pleasure to be speaking to you all.
Thank you. Bye-bye.